Hello, here we are for our last chapter, the reproductive system. Some might say we saved the best for last. So here we go. In case you're wondering, the reason I have a horse here is because Stormcat is one of the most famous studs of all time. So after his short racing career, he went out to pasture, so to speak, and then if he impregnated a female horse and it developed a live birth, it could cost over $500,000 because of his race lineage. So, what a stud. All right, so this chapter, not surprisingly, is broke down by sex. So we're first going to talk about the male, then we'll talk about the female. I'm going to talk a little bit about pregnancy and childbirth, but because of time constraints, we're not going to spend very much time on that at all, which is a little bit unfortunate because there's so much to talk about. But being where we are in the semester and just because of the time constraints, we have to cut corners somewhere. Let's start with the male. We'll talk about the anatomy, and then we're going to talk about sperm. Okay, actually, before we talk about the male, let's just make sure that we know some definitions. Let me get back to my little game here with the marker. Make sure you can define primary sex organ. And it's the same for males and for females. Primary sex organ just refers to whatever sex organ is present that produces the sex cell. Here it's called the gamete, which is fine, but really we're talking about a primary sex organ is whatever reproductive organ is present that produces the sex cell. So in the case of a biological male, it is the testes because they produce sperm. And in biological females, it is the ovaries because they produce the egg. The gametes are the sex cells, sperm and the egg, in addition to being able to unite to form a zygote. These sex cells also have the ability to secrete sex hormones, which we already know about from the previous chapter. Look how that works. So make sure you know what a gamete is and what they are. Every other organ of the reproductive system is considered to be secondary. I'm sorry, folks, they're just second because what we need most is the primary sex organ, which produces the sex cell. Everything else is secondary. And we're going to talk about various secondary sex organs as we go through the male anatomy and the female anatomy. There's also a term called sex characteristics. So because of the sex hormones, which biological males have much more testosterone and biological females have much more estrogen, these sex hormones produce secondary sex characteristics that only occur at and after puberty. So for females, this would include fat deposition in the hip region. In males, and in females, it would mean a higher pitch in the voice. And for males, it would include deepening of the voice, growth of hair on the face, etc. As always, make sure you're reviewing what I talk about and or what I underline. Okay, let's talk about the male. Now, I'm not here to start any biological sex warfare. However, anatomically and physiologically speaking, in terms of the reproductive system, the biological male is much simpler. That does not necessarily mean that men are simpler. Definitely not. In terms of the anatomy and physiology, it is simpler in males. Why? Because they have less to do. It's not any less important per se, because we need both sperm and the egg to come to the party. But in terms of overall functioning, really all the males have to do is produce and release the sperm. That's it. And because of its simpler nature, the anatomy of the male is simpler. When we get to the female, we'll talk about the anatomy and physiology of the reproductive system being much more complex. which is not to say that women are more complex overall. If you could only see my face right now, haha. But in terms of reproductive system, women have more to do. Not only do they have to produce and develop the egg, but they have to receive the sperm. It is the site of fertilization, and it is the job of the female solely to nourish the developing zygote and fetus, and then to push it out at childbirth. Oh, and we're still not done. The female is responsible for nurturing through developing breast milk even after birth. Okay, so we're talking about males. Let's talk about the male. Oh, here I started to draw without even having it on. The male reproductive system. These are the main organs that we're going to talk about. The goal of this chapter, being that we're at the end of the semester, the goal is to really just give you a foundation. We're going to talk about the main organs, what they do, and how they all work together in a pretty simple way. But that's just because of the time constraints. All right, so here we go. You can see that I've starred the things that you need to know. And of course, I will always be drawing. Let's talk about the testes. You should know what those are. They hang from the outside of the body. Inside of the testes are these coils called seminiferous tubules, which we're going to see on the next slide. If we look at the inside of the testy, I did not mean to zoom in on the inside of the testy, it just happened. We can see we have these coils, and all of these coils are collectively called the seminiferous tubules. Of course, because they are coiled, it allows us to have more surface area. And it is the job of these seminiferous tubules to produce sperm. So I'm going to go back. And it is the seminiferous tubules, the coils inside of each testy, that is responsible for producing sperm. The fact that they're coiled and laid out this way means that they have a lot of surface area. More surface area means they can produce more sperm. Now, of course, there are a bunch of other cells and structures that help, such as sustentacular cells and interstitial cells. For this class, you don't have to know them. The information is here if you need it. But I want to focus on the basics. And I also want to allow you time to prepare for the final exam, not overload you so much at this point in the semester. If you're wondering why the testes are held outside of the body, it is because it is a slightly cooler temperature. So if the testes were inside the body of the biological male, it would be at a slightly higher temperature that is not best for sperm development. So they hang outside the body, which promotes the best sperm production at a slightly cooler temperature. Okay, the scrotum is the pouch that holds the testes. So they have a little protective pouch. I'll try and be consistent. Sometimes I forget. So you should know what the scrotum is. It's the pouch. I do want to point out the spermatic cord. So the spermatic cord is, you can see it's shown here. If I could draw three-dimensional, I would say it's what's inside this. I have really bad drawing skills. This takes me back. It's really bad. But inside this tube, which is called the spermatic cord, is a big bundle: nerves, arteries, veins, lymphatics. Very important. Because the testes are situated outside of the body, we've got to make sure that we have a protected tube for all the nerves, arteries, veins, lymphatics that are necessary for the testes to be able to do what they do, which is produce sperm. Okay, so if we were to, I feel a sneeze coming on, I apologize. Excuse me. If we were to separate the physiology of the male reproductive system, we could talk about the functions of this reproductive system in steps. And the first step would be that this system has to produce sperm. So we're talking about functions of the male reproductive system. Well, the first function is it has to produce sperm. And we know where that happens. That happens inside the seminiferous tubules, these little coils inside the testes. After sperm is produced, we've got to transport that sperm. So these are the functions in order. Transport the sperm to the body. And that's what we're going to talk about here in these ducts. So if our first function is to produce sperm, the next function is that we have to transport that sperm up into the body. And that would be step number 2. And what are the structures that transport the sperm up into the body? The tubes, the duct system, which we're going to talk about. Let me just step ahead for a moment. What we're going to talk about is the third function, is that we have glands. We're going to talk about 3 glands that add to the sperm to produce semen. So we're going to talk about a series of glands. There's one gland here, they're paired. One gland here, which is also paired, and the final gland is the prostate gland. What we're going to find out shortly is that they add secretions as the sperm travels down on its way to the urethra or the penis, which is inside the penis. Because sperm alone is not enough. We need to provide a fluid medium to allow something for that sperm to swim in. We have to provide a bunch of other things. So step number 2 is that we transport the sperm up into the body through a series of ducts. Step number 3 is as that sperm continues down, the glands add things to it. So by the time we get to the urethra inside the penis, it is now semen, sperm plus the accessory gland secretions. And then the last step would, of course, be to deliver sperm into the female. If the goal is to form a baby, of course. And that this is accomplished via the penis, which we know. So I know I went ahead a little bit, but I wanted to lay out the functions. So these would be the functions of the male reproductive system. Okay, so we talked about step 1. The male produces sperm inside of the seminiferous tubules. Now let's talk about step 2, how that sperm gets transported up into the body. As I said before, it is transported up into the body through a series of ducts, and these are listed in order. I do want to pay attention to the note. Oh, seems that we have a technical problem. I'm going to have to pause this video and start up again when the pictures aren't all black. So we'll call this video number 1, and then we'll continue with video number 2. What other choice do we have? Okay, stay with me, folks.